Hi, Rosemary. How are you?
Hi Garrett, I'm doing pretty good. How are
Thanks
you?
for. I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for joining us. This is AME 111 special broadcast interview session. We're joined by Rosemary Jones. Rosemary is a second year and senior at the University of Washington, majoring in drama and comparative history. She has a background in stage management, both on campus and in the larger Seattle theater community, and intends to pursue it as a career. She's interested in how people create stories and profound experiences through communally playing, and investigates how alternative worlds can be used as a teaching tool through shared experiences such as live performance and tabletop games. When she's not embroiled in schoolwork or working on a show, she can be found tinkering, building, and fixing. Thank you so much for joining us, Rosemary. I think it's wonderful to have you here on the AME 111 podcast and to share a bit of your experiences with games. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So maybe a first question to get started here. Can you tell us how you got interested in working with games?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised on video games. I've been playing them for as long as I can remember. I started like getting really invested when I got into World of Warcraft as a kid. But I didn't start getting into tabletop games until I would have been 17, I think. I had played like a session or two, and then just goofing around, I made characters for all my friends, and then they had all these characters, and they were like, "Okay, we need to play now." And I was like, "Whoa, I'm way too busy to this." And then they bullied me into DMing a session for them, and it got me really invested because I was working like 70 hours a week then in a kitchen, and I had one day a week that I would get together with like 12 of my friends and run Dungeons and Dragons, and it was a godsend.
Cool, cool. So do you feel like, at the time when you got involved in RPGs, were you also working in theater already?
Um, I had actually just quit working in theater. I had been acting for about 3 years before that, and I had just decided to stop doing theater and was working full time.
Hmm. So when you're doing DM work or designing games and RPGs, do you find that now, since you're more involved in theater and stage management, do you find that these sorts of skill sets overlap in some ways?
Without a doubt. I mean, in drawing the comparison to the theater world, DMing's kind of like a mix of stage managing and directing.
Hmm.
And that, I mean, most of, especially when you're playing casually with some friends, most of the gambit of DMing is herding cats, getting them all in the same room, scheduling, and then keeping everybody focused while we're all having a good time. And that's peak stage management stuff. That's exactly what I do as a stage manager. And then a lot of my experiences of watching directors, 'cause directors, a good director has this really great ability to make all the work feel like we're just playing in the room, like we're just having a fun time and goofing around with things, and they'll kind of guide you towards a larger idea that they already have established. And that's really what DMing is to me. Is I have some core concepts, some core places I want us to go, and the whole time the players should feel like they're leading that experience.
Hmm. So one of the things that in preparing the lecture about RPGs that I gave to the class yesterday, that I came across that I thought was interesting was that in RPG video games, the way that transition between tabletop games into computational games, the way that that's characterized is that the kinds of mechanics of the DM or the GM become codified in the software in
Hmm.
some ways, right? So I'm wondering, it seems like actually doing tabletop work would permit you a bit more flexibility and improvisation because it's not sort of programmed in advance, right? Do you see any kind of analog then between like video game RPGs and theater in this way because you have like a set script that you get ahead of time?
Huh, that's interesting. I never thought to compare those, but I definitely think that there is some good comparison to make there, because the big thing with video game RPGs, and you look at like a lot of games in the early 2000s were quite literally RPG video games were just quite literally digitized D&D rules. Like
Mhm.
the one that comes to mind is Star Wars: The Old Republic,
Mm,
which was a great game, but it's quite literally like turn by turn Dungeons and Dragons combat, and it's how the conversations work,
mm,
except with a digitized DM. And I think that is really pretty similar in that, like, there's so much room to play with how you think about the script in theater and how you want to make choices around it. But you can't just go off and invent a place, invent a
mm.
reason. Like, you can't communally create entirely new things. At least if you're working in a traditional straight play type of setting.
Right, right. Maybe in more sort of improv,
Hmm.
especially comedic improv, right? That's some the sort of yes and is something which I also recognize in my limited experience with tabletop RPG, right? Is that the DM sort of has to be on one's feet, as it were,
Oh yeah,
open.
it's absolutely a game of yes and like just the slightest tweaking, and that's actually something that's really similar with stage management too. Whenever I'm interviewing, I tell my interviewers that exactly is my method as a stage manager is yes and no but, because a
Mm,
lot of times you have to tell someone no, that's game breaking, or no, we don't have the budget to do that,
mm,
or the time to do that, but here's a way we can take your idea and make it work for our setting.
hmm. So there's a lot of then I think similarities between games and theater.
Mhm.
What do you think that games allow you to do that theater doesn't?
I think a big one for a lot of games is not having an audience creates a very, very different relationship.
Mm,
In my research, I talk a lot about this idea of the magic circle, this idea that you kind of communally agree to um, suspend your belief of this world. You decide to lift this world up and commit entirely to it, and you can get away with all sorts of role play because you're all in a circle, equally committed to the idea of this world, and you can forego your own world.
hmm,
In theater, you have that happen on stage, but you're also surrounded by a ring of people who have a varying level of commitment. Instead, they are committed that the world you have made is real, but they are not a part of it. They have agreed that they are separate. They are a observer of the world that you have put together. And so that's a really it just creates an entirely different tone for how it's portrayed. For one, there's a type of honesty that or consistency that has to happen in theater, of like you have to feel like you have to be true to your audience. You can't give one audience a different experience. You have to um bring the same thing to the audience, and someone's holding you accountable. You have to bring them something.
mhm.
When it's just a circle of people playing together, it's a very different type of accountability. You have to uphold your end of the role playing bargain, but you're not delivering a good. And I think also in that end, it allows for more of that exploration, because you can establish a trust with everyone in your circle, because you know that everyone in your circle is doing the same thing, like they're also role playing, and so you get together and you both decide to explore, because you're both there, you're both vulnerable, and it's easier to be vulnerable in that way. So I think the rehearsal room of theater is kind of similar to a game. I think they're a lot closer, but when you get out on the stage, it becomes different.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up rehearsing because I think actually, maybe this is taking us a bit too far afield, but in any case, it feels like rehearsal is maybe one of the most important social institutions of, let's say, music making from my own
Mhm.
experience, but also experience in theater. I know this is also quite important. But in theater, you also have a different kind of responsibility, right? You have a responsibility to the playwright, you have a responsibility to the director, to the producer, and to this, like you said, the sort of vision of your interpretation of the theater piece. as the company has agreed on it, that
Mhm.
something you want to sort of deliver consistently. Um, what do you feel like? One of the things that we talked about in Stardew Valley was about intention, right? And there is there's some conversation about whether there's a right way or a wrong way to play a game. And because Stardew
Mm.
Valley is this kind of very open game, right? It's a place in which you might intuit that you're intended to go and farm some things, right? You're intended to go and harvest some things. You're also intended to develop some relationships with people, right? It seems like, I guess, what do you think about the role of intention in developing these kinds of games, and especially in open-ended games like the one that you've put together?
I think it's a difficult one because my first impulse was to say like a fucking intention, like I believe that you should do whatever you want to do. And then I remembered that every time I play with character or with players that are really like mechanically driven,
Hmm.
it annoys me to no end. My brother is an example of that. I've played with my brother a lot, and he loves playing the game mathematically. Like that's the thing that he loves about role-playing games is he loves the mechanical structures. He loves making graphs of like what the best way to do something is and whatnot.
Hmm.
And it makes me so mad. Like it's about the narrative. You should have fun. Stop thinking strategically. Like stop it. You need to have fun. And he's having a blast. So it's tense. So I think in video games, I am a strong belief that when you are distanced from the creator, then intentionality can be thrown out the window,
Hmm.
kind of in a the author is dead sort of way with something like Stardew Valley, where you're just in this world sort of alone. Then you should explore it however you want to. When it comes to tabletop games, it becomes a little bit different because you're in this world with the creator and you are actively the creator as well. So while you should do what you want with it, you have to recognize that that there's a direct causal relationship between you and other creators.
Hmm.
That if you're doing whatever you want with it, you are also changing the way the other people are playing it, and you're changing the way that the GM is playing it and responding to you.
Hmm.
So it becomes an interpersonal thing of how you interact with people, and so what your group intention is.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like it's absolutely more immediate than the sort of feedback channels that are maybe open between developers and game players.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, you could also see, like, I saw somebody do a study on League of Legends, and they were talking about the ways in which the community would articulate certain things about the game that they liked or did, like that weren't working, that were working, and then the team would implement some of these and try and respond to them. Obviously, at a tabletop session, this is going to be happening much more quickly, right? Um,
Exactly.
so I actually have some more things to talk about, but I think we should get into your game, actually. Could you tell us a bit about Blank Spaces and how you started developing this?
Yeah, so I started working on Blank Spaces through an intensive building program here at UW. We were set to build a world, and I was feeling very scared about this idea of like building an artifact because it just didn't make sense to me, and role-playing games did. So I settled on a role-playing game. And where I really got started was I started reading into other role-playing games and realizing how much bias is built into mechanical systems, and how much social just how much information social information is programmed into mechanical systems, i.e. there's a lot of fantasy racism written into Dungeons and Dragons, like
Mm-hmm.
a ton. Like half orcs are all evil, dark elves are all evil, everyone hates them. If you're playing them, you got to play them this way. That's wild. And you look at older editions, and like women couldn't max their strength as high as men characters could. Like
Mm.
it's crazy. These are things that people actively chose to include in their mechanical systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I got really invested in the idea of player autonomy in these games, and how do we create a game that lacks that bias, lacks that fantasy racism, and really allows a character to just create and explore, while still having like a driven plot and a world it's set in. So with blank spaces, the characters wake up in an unfamiliar space, in an unfamiliar body. They don't know where they are. They don't know who they are. They simply wake up, and then they are guided and given the opportunity to pick out like a set of gear that they came here with. They get some weapons, they get some armor, they get some adventuring equipment, essentially. And then they get to design their body in completion, like just top down design their body. It's a really fascinating process, the sort of stuff people will make. I can get in that a whole nother alleyway, the sort of things people make. But that's sort of the original basis of the game was, all right, then let's just, to avoid any sort of fantasy racism, let's get rid of racialized perks. Let's just have you make your body, and I'll make sure it's not game breaking. The other big mechanical things of this is it works on a very heavy player GM relationship, in that things like the magic system is also entirely customizable. The player picks a school of magic that they're proficient in, and then they get to create and write their own spells. They get to shape that magic the way that they would like to see the magic work. They have an idea of what they want to do with the magic. They explain it, and then I figure out the mechanics. I say, okay, then roll this dice, and we'll see how that works. And there's also a lot of conversation back and forth, because I meshed together the D20 system, the Powered by the Apocalypse system, and a little bit of Fate, the Fate core system. And so there's a lot of conversation too around like, well, what trait do you think you're trying to do when you do this? Like if you're trying to convince someone, is it manipulate, or is it skullduggery? Are you, and so there's a lot of conversation back and forth about, what do you think you're doing? What do you think the best item to roll is? And then the last big important feature is I was very specific about leaving aesthetics of the world blank. Like I insert some here and there, but I did my best to let the player take aesthetic control of the world. Let the player imagine the world the way that they saw it. And a lot of times when players would ask me something about a location, like in the time we played, Garrett, I think you all asked me if there were like sports flags or something in this bar that we were in. I turned that up to the players. I would say, they would ask me, is this here? And I would ask them, is it, do you think it's here? Because sure, yes, then it is. Yeah, so the big goal of my game was to create a free and autonomous space for players where there was also a really firm established player GM conversation going the whole time.
Okay, there's so much here. I think this is really interesting. So I want to go back to what you were saying about basically codified bias, right? Or what you called fantasy racism or fantasy sexism, right? There's two things about this, and I hope we can try to unpack this. One is about the stakes, and I think to do a devil's advocate argument here, some people would suggest, well, what does it matter? It's just a fantasy world, right? So that's one thing that I want to say, and I'd like for us to unpack that. I think that's really important. Two, I think what's interesting is that what you're suggesting is that there's a way in which these kinds of biases are reinforced by the mechanics of a game, right? And if I can sort of try and interpret what you've done here with particularly with the character creation mechanism, is to eliminate those mechanics, to basically eliminate any pre-given schema, right? Race, religion, sex, orientation, etc., so that one can sort of just freely intermingle in identity in a different way, right? This is really interesting, I think, also contemporary, right? Because Cyberpunk 2077 was recently criticized for their character creation, which was only two genders, right? It was only male or female, and they went and basically added a third option, right? Which was, okay, now you can be androgynous or something, right? What you've done is a step beyond that, which is to say, well, there's no pre-given options at all, right? Which is an interesting thing, right? So maybe we could say something about that. Yeah, and I'll tie in one of the readings about Stardew Valley as well. One of the arguments that Ian Bogost and some other people make is that the kinds of choices or the kinds of mechanics that you choose to make available to players, they express a certain kind of argument about the world, right? So if we basically assume that video games, or even let's say tabletop role-playing games, are simulations of some kind of the world, we can't simulate everything, right? We just can't do that. There's not enough computational power, simply put. So what you choose, the kinds of decisions that you make as a developer to make available to people, give some kind of argument about that world. Those things have meaning, right? In other words, those things have meaning. So how does this maybe relate to what people actually do end up doing with respect to their character creation in your game? Maybe there's an opportunity to reflect on what people actually did and the kinds of, even though you eliminated this sort of option to do a bias, right? The kinds of bias that still get brought in based on having lived in the world.
I think for one, I think a really great example of the sort of like information you create about the world is the way leveling is looked at in a lot of games. Just a really simple one is a system I used for my game, Powered by the Apocalypse, grants levels based off of failing. If you fail a roll, you get experience points. I switched that and started granting experiences for succeeding on rolls. If you succeeded at a specific margin, you would get an experience point. It's just a really tiny but meaningful difference about how things are learned. Do you learn through your failures or do you learn through your successes? But regarding the stakes and how people played and stuff, I think the best way to talk about it is through one of my players specifically, my friend Sydney, who actually I just moved in with. They're my roommate now. Anyways, my friend Sydney, when making the game, Sydney actively and immediately decided to make what they called specifically their ideal body. Sydney made a 6-foot tall robot that had several extra arms, long claws, a blank, emotionless face that would display things like waveform of speech and sometimes emotions on an LED screen, and was also... Oh, here, sorry. Oh, no, we have not frozen. I thought we had for a moment. We're good. And was also specifically a genderless robot. Furthermore, when Sydney continued to play the game, they inserted an entire narrative about robot rights into the game. They inserted a whole narrative about robot oppression. They were talking about, in one of the very first encounters of the game, outside of Tamara's enhancement clinic, there's this kind of like big hullabaloo going on. And I mention in that description that there are beings, purely synthetic beings there, people that you cannot distinguish any flesh upon. And Sydney immediately goes, I raise my fist in solidarity because, and then they proceeded to explain to me all of the different layers of robot oppression in this world. They distinguished 3 separate tiers of robots, what robots' role were in this world, and things like this. So because they had this blank space to work in, because the world was very indefinite, they brought their baggage along with them. They walked into this world and went, in this world, there is I am existing in a narrative that is parallel to my own, because Sydney is a genderqueer lesbian who's very familiar with that sort of like social ostracization that happens and the kind of solidarity that's formed in that crucible and things like that. And so Sydney walked into this world carrying their baggage of their own world and inserted into it this whole other narrative, because it then allowed them to be empowered about it. Then in this world, Sydney was able to take actions that fought that oppression that they saw in the real world, that fought that experience that they've had to live through. Further down the line in Sydney's play, the second Sydney basically came across the policing force of this world, penal sec. Sydney was immediately like, fuck those guys. Those are the pigs. They're fascists. I want nothing to do with them. And the second Sydney came across an anarchist an anarchist faction, Sydney was immediately like, now this is what I'm down with. Let's fuck it up. Let's really take some action here. And a big part of it when we talked about it was Sydney actually still works there at a location in Tacoma that's about less than a mile away from the Northwest Detention Center, which is the largest concentration camp in America. And Sydney was talking about how every time working as a cashier at this grocery store, they would have customers come up and ask how they were doing, and Sydney would just have to, before saying, fine, think about the fact that that concentration camp was right around the corner and there was nothing they could do about it. Absolutely nothing. There's no level of empowerment. So the second Sydney stepped into the world, Sydney began identifying ways that they were now empowered in this world and identifying ways that they could use that empowerment to kind of wreak the havoc that they wanted to wreak then and there. Wreak the havoc that was so built up within them, and it gave them a type of self-identification and release and a lot else, like it gave them a lot of ability to just kind of get things off of their chest and feel empowered for once about their own surroundings. Yeah, and I think that's where the stakes of like you said, it's the devil's advocate argument of it's just a game. Why does it matter that there's fantasy sexism and racism built into it? Because of how and why people play these games. And I want to destroy the stigma of the power trip or the power fantasy these games enable as somehow derogatory and for basement wizards and whatnot. But this power fantasy is actually really, this power fantasy is something that we need. It's something that actually empowers us in our day-to-day, because when we can access it in a fantasy world, we can begin to explore our options in the real world. If you can play a character that does these things, you can start identifying exactly what stops you from doing them in your real life. We were able to sit down and I was able to ask Sydney, well, why did you feel empowered in this game? And they were like, well, because if I die in the game, I don't die in real life, because I have magical abilities and I own weapons and like all of these things. And you can begin to start identifying where action can begin to take place in the real world. And so when a mechanical system projects the oppression you see in the real world into your world, how are you supposed to grapple with that? Like, how are you supposed to feel empowered when the physics of your world wreak the same oppression that the physics of your own world do?
I mean, it also strikes me that your game is something of a sort of sci-fi. It's maybe more sci-fi inflected than fantasy in some ways. And one of the things that you see frequently in science fiction is both an interplay between utopian and dystopian fiction writing, which has a long history of being a way in which one can start to compose, or the way in which not only one, but entire collectives or political factions can start to articulate, a political economy of the future, or kind of something that can be envisioned. And likewise, you see that science fiction, which I'm more familiar with than fantasy, is a way in which you can actually grapple with the issues of the day But by inflecting them different and by turning them, a different hue and a different color and so on and so forth, you can start to you become alienated from it and you sort of see it as a mirror, right? So I'm thinking of like Battlestar Galactica, which grapples with a sort of post 9/11 paranoia, right?
Hmm.
Something which at the time was very real, and then it served as a kind of sort of mirror this way. So I guess just to sort of come back to the question of blank spaces, it seems like the idea of the blank space, right, is not for, and I'm asking you to comment on this. For you, I think it sounds like it's not that you want to create a blank space where it's a tabula rasa and we sort of erase all of our inherited knowledge, right? But it's a different kind of gesture, right? What do you think can you say more about this sort of blank space gesture here?
I think that's a really acute observation, and it's actually something I've been trying to incorporate into the theatrical world more too. I think a lot of times our really good art comes from the restraints that are placed upon it, comes from trying to fit things in between the cracks and trying to make it work for your restrictions. And so this blank space is not a tabula rasa, but instead it's a paper with margins. It's a spot where you can put something.
Yeah.
And it is by no means a requirement of leaving anything behind. It is not supposed to be a blank space of the self. It is supposed to be a kind of like you said, a mirror. It's supposed to be a way to project the self outward into something. Yeah. The blank space is more like a Mad Lib almost. Of like, you've got a whole sentence and here's your spot for improvisation, and the sentence continues.
Yeah.
um
This reminds me of Marshall McLuhan talks about hot media and cold media, and I think he says movies are hot media, and it's because there's very little room for you. It demands so much of your attention.
mhm.
There's very little room for you to insert your own interaction, your own sort of imagination, right? Where he says radio, by contrast, is a cool media because you only have this sort of audio, right? And you're able to sort of like fill in the blanks, so to speak, of that media form. And it strikes me that, games like Stardew Valley, in which you can take whatever kind of experience that you have and play it in whatever way you want, is really a kind of cool media in this way. And it seems like tabletop role-playing games afford the same kind of flexibility.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely a scale to it, but I definitely think a lot of video games are, and Stardew Valley is one of those more cool media type things.
Mm-hmm. So I guess to get towards digital media and games, as we start to kind of wrap up here, it seems like some of the limitations of digital games are the same kinds of constraints that you have in theater, as you were just saying,
Mhm.
right? Is that you have to sort of develop a story ahead of time, or at least if it's an interactive story and there are multiple outcomes, you have to code those all in advance, right? Um, have you ever worked with digital media and games, and are you interested in this, or what are your thoughts about that?
So I've never worked with building or like creating games. I mean, I played a little bit with digital media and like recording things and whatnot, interactive stuff. I had a YouTube Let's Play series for a little while with actually also with Sydney, and that's a sort of interacting with digital media. But the bulk of my experiences with digital media that I mentioned earlier comes from playing World of Warcraft. I actually just started getting back into World of Warcraft with all this quarantine downtime. I got a bunch of my friends into it. Yeah, and it's been awesome. I realized that I've been playing World of Warcraft for 10 years now. Literally half of my life I've been playing this game. And a reading that was really influential on my research pointed out the space. I can send this one to you. It's by Catherine Cross. It pointed out the space that games like World of Warcraft or other MMOs make for gender exploration.
Mm-hmm.
This was really fascinating to read because she was talking about being a kid playing World of Warcraft and using it as a way to explore gender roles, because you're in this MMO setting where you're surrounded by other players all the time. Like, I mean, the bulk of you can do solo questing and things like that, but usually the bulk of what you do in World of Warcraft is dungeon, where you're in a group of 5 people working through something. And even when you're not, you're surrounded by people when you're questing. And when you're in the hometowns, you're in this massive chat that's filled with everybody on your server. But you also have a physical avatar. And so people will use that to create personas. And it was really fun reading this essay about her experimenting with her gender when she was, a kid playing World of Warcraft. And I was like, I do that. I was absolutely doing that as a kid. And it was just really fascinating to read about. And so I think something that I find really interesting in digital media is that space of interaction. And I don't know a lot about Stardew Valley, but I know there is some level of online interaction in Stardew Valley. And I'm really curious about how that might take shape, because I think these digital worlds create a really, really interesting space for self-exploration. And that idea was really inspiring for me in creating a game that was self-exploration.
Hmm. Hmm. Thanks. So maybe just one last question. I mean, how do you think, one, like, what do you think the future of games and digital media will bring with respect to exploring the self? And what are you interested in exploring next with games?
Where it'll go in the future is a really great question. I think tabletop games have definitely leaned more and more and continue to lean more and more towards the explorative and the narrative explorative. There's still like a lot of mechanical games, but I mean D&D 5e was a huge departure from a Dungeons and Dragons tradition and a lean towards the more narrative as opposed to the more war mechanic. And they've just recently kind of had a resurgence of role-playing games being more popular in the last 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I definitely think there is a lean more towards, I think people feel the need for that sort of exploration more. And I think it's specifically games have created a lot of unique spaces for queer people.
Mm-hmm.
In that's part of the popularization of role-playing games has been popularized by queer people using that as a space. And I think the same thing with games like Stardew Valley and Animal Crossing have a really large queer following, because they have a similar space of this ability to just play the domestic, in getting to be yourself and still playing the domestic fantasy, which is something we're often deprived of in the real world. So as far as where they'll go in the future, I think there's a strong trend towards that, a strong trend towards the insertive narrative and towards the creation of a character and the interaction in a world. Cyberpunk 2077, although has its problems, I think is a great example of that too. And then as far as areas I've explored and am exploring, trust is a big one. This idea of the magic circle has been very fascinating to me, and it's I have a thesis project to do, and it's one that I'm going to continue to explore. And this idea of I'm really curious how we can take these experiences of play and broaden them, or use them for specific types of information sharing, like using them for active teaching, or how we can broaden these fantasies so more people can be included in it at a time, and things like that. And this is just kind of like my weird little side project. I'm really curious about drawing parallels between the magic circle and actual literal historical magic. This idea of getting together and casting an incantation in a group, and how that is similar and differs to the idea of getting together and creating a world as a group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the last place that I am most certainly going is I've actually just recently accepted a job stage managing a show for Dacha, and they specialize in interactive theater, and they're doing, God willing, nothing gets canceled this summer. they are getting a group together and devising, with the help of a group from Boston called the Boston, what's it called? They're an educational group focusing around theater and game design.
Hmm.
And they're all getting together here in Seattle to devise a carnival that will have a sort of plot based around capitalism in this world and how we can influence and whatnot. But the goal is that it will be non-linear and directly influenced by the audience members. The audience members will walk through and interact with the actors, and the choices audience members will make will shape the outcome of the night, and hopefully will act as a space for players, or for audience members to explore alternatives to capitalism. So where I'm going next is trying to bring this into the. Oh, have you lost me? I think Garrett has lost my audio.
If you can hear me, but your audio cut out here.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Oh, now I can hear you. Sorry,
perfect.
you were just saying this would act as participants would be able to interact with this theater with the carnival, and it would act as a space for
exploring alternatives to capitalism, essentially. So yeah, where I'm going next is hoping to incorporate all these ideas into the theatrical world and figure out how to bring an audience member along with.
Amazing. I mean, it sounds like in some ways you're bringing the role-playing, or this project will bring role-playing games to another scale, to the theatrical scale, which is dealing with, deconstructing the audience in new ways. It's super fascinating. Congratulations on the job. That's super cool.
Thank you. I'm real excited about it.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see what comes of it. Well, we've probably spoken a bit too long, but that's great. This has been super fascinating. I want to thank you again, Rosemary, for sharing your work with us and sharing your thoughts about games and theater. I'm going to encourage anybody in the class to also shout out with some questions. If you have anything that you'd like to know, I'm happy to pass it on to Rosemary, and if she has time, she can respond. But yeah, thank you so much, Rosemary. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And feel free to like distribute my email or things like that. I'm really happy to talk more with anybody about this stuff. I love it. I could talk about it forever.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.